My name again is Jim Carpenter. I have been privileged to be hosting this pathway during this week. I heard several good talks, and tonight is our last talk on this creation care pathway. This is what I titled this talk: The Earth is the Lord's, where do we fit in? And you might think that's kind of a silly question, but it actually is a serious question to me. What is our role? What is our place on this earth? And by extension, how do we treat this earth? We have been listening to other speakers all week talking about the earth and how we as Christians should care about it and how we should care about each other. Especially, I really appreciated the talk last night from Kent Smith and Ian Shelburne, because they were focusing on our responsibilities to other people in relation to our responsibilities to the earth. And I really appreciated them combining those two things, because they are obviously responsibilities to Christians. We can't ignore the earth to benefit people. We can't ignore people to benefit the earth. And that's kind of where I'm going with my talk tonight. So, if you read the introduction to this pathway, we were basically looking at this concept of peace with the earth. So thinking of that, I want us to recognize, first of all, that God created earth with us in mind, not the devil and his angels. So if that's true, why do so many people think of the earth as our adversary, something to be conquered, as if we could live without it? But at the same time, we can't be self-righteous. We have to recognize that our attitude towards the earth is at least partly shaped by our circumstances. The other night, as I was writing some thoughts on this, a cold wind was blowing, driving a freezing rain, right before the earliest snow on record for Abilene. Yet, where I was, I sat in a warm, dry, well-lit room, drinking hot tea and listening to the wind blow. I was quite content. Would I prefer to be sitting out in the elements with no modern technology or conveniences? I freely admit I would not. Yet this technology comes at an environmental cost. How much am I willing to sacrifice to lessen my impact on earth? How much does God expect me to sacrifice? How can I condemn others for the sacrifices they are unwilling to make? And when faced with the choice of bringing others to Christ or reducing the harm I bring to creation, would God rather I abandon those made in his image? These are questions we ponder as we consider our responsibilities to God. And there is no easy answer and no simple solution. Well, let's stop for a minute and go back to the beginning. Genesis 1:1, in fact. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Now let's skip up to verse 26. "Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." And then it doesn't leave it there. It actually reinforces that in verse 28. He reiterates it. "God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Now, these verses have long been used to condemn the Judeo-Christian tradition as being at best indifferent and at worst antagonistic to protecting the environment. Lynn White Jr. is perhaps the most well-known for making that argument. when he published The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis in March of 1967. But the sin of environmental degradation is not confined to those holding Judeo-Christian values. One only needs to look at the damage being done in China and India to realize that. Still, do these exact accusations hold water? Can we use Genesis to justify actions that harm our home here? What is the proper exegesis of these verses? Before I dive into that topic, and why am I reminded of that saying, fools rush in? Why don't we try to see how our Father views the earth? And I maybe need to go ahead and preface this talk. It's a little late to preface the talk, I guess, but throw in right now something that was mentioned earlier. I am not a theologian. I don't play a theologian on TV. So take my exegesis as you will. I'm not an expert in this. So, my personal beliefs of how our Father views the earth based on Scripture. I believe that God likes and enjoys his creation. I believe that God created all creation, not just us, to praise and glorify him. I believe that all of earth, not just humanity, was bound up in suffering as a result of the fall. And I believe that God intends for creation to point humanity towards him. So let's go back to Genesis 1. At the end of God's creating, in the very last verse of Genesis 1, it says, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. He didn't say, God saw man, and it was very good. Or God saw a woman, and she was very good. It said, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. Apparently, God really liked all of his creation. On Monday's talk, Dr. John Hicks discussed Psalm 104, which described God providing for his creatures. And if you want to flip to Psalm 104, flip along with me, or scroll if you're on your phone. Look at verses 10 through 14. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Beside them, the birds of the heavens dwell. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth and wine to gladden the heart of man. This whole psalm, as Dr. Hicks discussed on Monday, is talking about how God enjoys his creation. In verse 26 of this psalm, he even talks about Leviathan frolicking. Now, y'all remember Leviathan. Go back to Job. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job. In Job, chapter 41, what do we know about Leviathan? Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook? Press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will you play with him as with the bird? I'm skipping. Will traders bargain over him? Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Behold, the hope of a man is false. He is laid low, even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Who then is he to stand before me? Okay. So here in Job, God is talking about Leviathan and how intimidating Leviathan is, how huge, how fierce Leviathan is. But in Psalm 104, he talks about Leviathan frolicking. And I love the image that Dr. Hicks gave of God looking at Leviathan frolicking in the ocean and enjoying it. So again, Psalm 104 is thought to be an exclamation of the joy God finds in his creation. So God enjoys in his creation. And his creation is doing what God created it to do. In Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the earth. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Psalm 96, verse 11, let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad, let all that is in it, let the fields be jubilant and everything in them, let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Or Psalm 95, which may pop a song into your head. Come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. He is our God. In his hands are the depths of the earth, the heights of the mountain. Okay? But we can move away from Psalms. Look at Isaiah 43. Isaiah 43, verse 20. The wild animals honor me, the jackals and the owls, because I provide water in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland to give drink to my people, my chosen. So God enjoys his creation, and the creation honors God, praises God, and glorifies God by what it's doing, just in its actions. So the third point, all of earth was bound up in suffering. And I recognize there is some disagreement on this point. So again, I'm not a theologian by training, but if you go to Romans 8, which was talked about earlier in this pathway, Romans 8, verse 19. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. Now, I admit that there's one school of thought that this is only talking about humans. I don't see that myself. I think he is talking about all of creation. And again, there are others that go into much more detail in this than I will even try to do tonight. And I encourage you to look up some of these other sources if you have questions about that. But I do think that, again, all of creation is suffering because of our sin. So the fourth point, God intends for his creation to point us towards him. As our colleague Jim Cook was fond of saying, creation is God's first book and the Bible was his second. Go back to Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. To whom are they proclaiming? God doesn't need them to proclaim to him. So who are they convincing? Who are they telling this to? Let's go to Romans. I know I'm flipping a lot in the scripture. I don't think of that as a bad thing. Go to Romans 1. As I look for it, where is it? Okay. Romans 1, starting in verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. They're without excuse. Creation is supposed to be showing us God. Whether we accept it, whether we see it, that's on us. But that's part of the creation. So this is how I think God views creation. So let's go back to that first question. Where do we fit in? Genesis 1 says we are to, quote, rule over his creation. Does that mean God gave it to us? Is it ours? If it's ours, we can do whatever we want with it. It belongs to us. I don't think that's true, because the Bible to me shows quite clearly that God does not believe he gave the earth to us. Take a look at Psalm 24. Let's get back. I'm sure you know this verse. The earth is the Lord's, where I got my title, and the fullness thereof, the world and all those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. That includes all the creatures. Go to Psalm 50. Again, back to verse 10 of Psalm 50. For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine. So the world doesn't belong to us. The world belongs to God. So again, where does that place us? If Genesis 1 doesn't say God is giving us the earth, what does it mean? What is he doing? I like the analogy that's given by Sandra Richter in a book that actually just came out this year, and I just got last week. It's called The Stewards of Eden. And in this book, she gives an image of what she thinks God is doing here. And as she puts it, God is the sovereign who gave humanity a land grant. And so it's like a king who has a servant, maybe a lord, and the lord is given a land grant. And the lord is supposed to take care of this land. And the lord has authority, but only the authority given by the king. And the lord is supposed to be ruling that land in the name of the king, doing what the king wants. So the way she put it, and I'm quoting her here, we are to serve as custodian and steward, enacting God's will by living our lives as a reflection of God's image. We have received our authority from the Creator. We rule as he would rule. We are stewards, not kings. And that was from page 11 of that book, Stewards of Eden. So that is the view that I hold. I hold a stewardship view. And that's also why I like the term earth keeping rather than creation care, because I believe God has designated us as keepers of the earth. And if that's true, then it means that we should protect the earth from harm, right? How does God react when we fail in this duty? Again, Dr. Hicks brought up this point in his talk, and I'm going to quote from the written version of his talk. It should not surprise us, I think, that in passionate worship, we also display a passionate commitment to God's goodness. Should we not be angry with poachers who endanger the black rhino? Should we not be angry about pollutants that render our air and waters toxic? Should we not be angry about plastics that fill our ocean and endanger its wildlife? That seems straightforward. If we have the view that I've just been espousing here, if we are supposed to be keeping the earth, and part of keeping the earth means protecting it from harm, including harm from us, then yes, we should be passionate about this. We should be angry. However, look at Psalm 8. The 8th Psalm, I'm skipping back again. I'm sorry, I don't have all these memorized. I am not Cliff Barbaric. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens out of the mouth of babe. I'm skipping ahead to verse 3. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. Now, I recognize that this is a prophecy and talking about Jesus Christ, but I also believe it's talking about man, and it's one of those prophecies that has a double meaning. But again, I will reiterate, I am not a theologian, so I may be wrong. But to me, it shows that God does put humans in a special place. We are not, in God's eyes, I don't believe we are equal with other life forms on the planet. In fact, Jesus himself in Matthew, well, that's not the right one. I'm sorry. When Jesus says that God knows when a sparrow falls, and then he follows that up with, are you not worth more than many sparrows? To me, that's clear. We have more value than other things he's created. But that doesn't mean that they have no value. I hope I've shown in the early part of this talk that I believe firmly that God places value on all of his creation. So that brings the problem, the quandary. How do we balance the needs of those made in God's image against the harm such provisioning does to the earth? How do we deal with this in practical terms? And I'll use a couple of maybe extreme examples here. Is the poacher, that poacher of the black rhino, when all he's doing is trying to feed his family, he may have no concept of the ecological consequences of his action. Is he to be condemned as a sinner? What about the person who uses plastic? Or those of us who use fossil fuels to heat their homes or to get from one place to another? If we're not willing to condemn ourselves as sinners because of the contributions we make, where do we draw the line? So balancing the needs, or balancing meeting the needs, I should say, of people against the harm that this causes to the earth This is the trick that we have yet to master. I do have a suggestion though. It's an analogy that I've come up with recently, so please forgive me if it's a little rough. But I'm going to share the screen again, and I want to show you all a picture, if I can do this. And let's go back to the PowerPoint. So there we are. And now I've got to go to the next PowerPoint. Oh, that's not going to work, Jim. Shoot. There we go. Y'all see that picture? That is a beautiful picture, is it not? You might recognize it. Van Gogh, olive trees. This is a field. Notice the people over here. This is about 1.5 acres, and it's an example of what's called crop art, created by a man in Minnesota, I believe, named Stan Hurd. And I'm going to now stop sharing the screen. You're welcome to look this picture up. I stole it off the internet. But that is an amazing picture, as somebody said there. To create this piece of art, Stan Hurd used grasses, wildflowers, along with numerous types of squash, gourds, and melons. So he has literally a living work of art that is pretty complex, especially for human art. Now, what if somebody came up to him, hungry, starving, and Mr. Hurd could only help this person by giving some of the food in that artwork? He could give him some of the melons. He could give him some of the other produce, some of the squash maybe. In fact, he could continue to do that all summer long, all season, as long as that garden was producing the fruit. He could keep giving them food and not harm the artwork. You would never know the difference. Now imagine people coming in on their own. They take the food. They take whole plants. Because they want to be able to take more food, they bring in their truck. They knock down the berms, load up the truck, and leave the tracks as they take it out. How do you think Mr. Hurd would react to that? How would you have reacted if it were yours? Again, I know it's kind of a rough analogy, but that crop art of Mr. Hurd's, compare that to the earth from God. I do believe that God created the earth to provision us, to give us life, and we should be joyful on this earth. But we can't abuse it. And I'm going to modify a phrase that I think was first coined by Gandhi. I'm not entirely sure. But I believe that God wants us to meet our need, not our greed. I think God will excuse damage to the earth if we are using only what we have to use to survive. I may be wrong in that, but I'm pretty convinced that God will not excuse and is angered by us being profligate, being wasteful without thinking, without needing things. I just did an exercise with my class where I had them estimate how much food they were throwing away over a several-day period. And some of the students were amazed at what they were throwing away and ashamed of it. They hadn't thought about it before. So anyway, part of my title was Developing a Christian Ecological Ethic. And so basically everything that I've talked about tonight is what leads to this concept of a Christian ecological ethic. And by the way, I'm not really thrilled with the term environmental ethic. I like ecological ethic better. And there are different versions of the Christian ecological ethic. And I do subscribe more to the stewardship version of that. And I would encourage you to study this concept more. There are several scholars, including Stephen Boom, a Prediger, who are developing this further. They're looking at the Christian ecological ethic, but then tying it to virtues. So tying Christian virtues to earth-keeping. And if you remember, the classical virtues, the 4 classic cardinal virtues that actually predate Christianity: prudence, justice, temperance, and courage. Prudence, wise thinking. I can't say that word without thinking of George H.W. Bush. But prudence, thinking through what you're doing, not acting rashly. Justice, being just to other people as well as the earth. Temperance, holding ourselves back, restraining ourselves, restraining our appetites. And courage, having the strength to stand up for what you really believe in. So think about how these things, these 4 virtues, can be connected to earth-keeping. Now also think about the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. Think about how these can be tied to earth-keeping. For those of you that were part of the earlier talks, the previous talks over the last couple of days, think about how the things they talked about, how they can relate to these virtues. And think about what Dr. Smith and Dr. Shelburne talked about last night with the communities. Think about what Don Galbraith talked about with climate change. How these tie to the virtues, with Christian responsibilities. And also, it doesn't really tie in, but I have to throw in right now that Dr. Jernigan's talk on wilderness theology and the role wilderness plays and can play in developing our connection to God. That is such a part of me, I can't even explain how much I need wilderness to connect me to God. So before I close, I want to go back to this whole concept of the tension between Christianity and environmentalism, because there's no doubt it exists. And I want to give you 3 thoughts. So think about these 3 things. Why should we as Christians surrender care for God's creation to those who may not even know God? Why do the secularists get to claim caring for God's earth? 2, it was mentioned in an earlier talk, and I've also heard people say that they're not worried about using up resources because maybe that'll just spur Jesus to come back sooner. I think there's a real danger in trying to force God's hand. God is not going to change his timeline to meet us just because we use up things faster than he wanted us to. And thirdly, for those who hesitate to advocate for the environment, to advocate for God's creation, because it's tied so much to leftist thoughts or to again, the secular world, are we more concerned with our image than we are with serving God? So convincing Christians that safekeeping the world that our Father created and put us on, it's not turning away from God. It's not saying that we're joining the secularists. It's fulfilling our duty to him. And that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Jim, I was really struck by the importance and the power of what you're saying about the kind of the core driving ethics and values that shape Christians, that ought to cause us to not be people who are watching others take the lead in care for the earth and keeping the earth, but rather to be the leading voices. You know, we have, if we take seriously what you've been saying, we have an invitation and a call from God to join God in this enormously important work of caring for the creation. And boy, the world needs it right now. And I was just thinking about how those virtues that you were describing really all get learned. This is again back to our upstream thinking yesterday. They all get learned in communities, ideally in healthy families, right? Where people learn to love themselves, they learn to love others, even others who are different than them, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, grandparents, and they learn to love the world that God has made, because those who are older and wiser and who appreciate the creation teach them to love and to value the world that's been made. And so, I mean, if we push the challenges of our time in terms of our relationship with creation all the way up the stream to the source of that, I think it's because people don't know how to love. And bottom line, to love appropriately, love God, love people, love what God has made, God's creation. And it just strikes me that we often look for solutions that feel so far out of reach. You know, how am I going to fix global warming or climate change? How am I going to fix the levels of pollution that are out there? And you know, there's a real sense in which some of us have that calling, but very few of us, percentage-wise, will have that calling. But all of us can attend to loving God and loving creation where we are, and using the influence we have to help other people see that same set of values. So just I really love the importance that you're tying between creation care and the formation of people as people in God's image that value things and value people the same way that God does.
Thank you. Did the other panelists see the comment from Larry, or the question from Larry? Could you comment on the accounting God is demanding in the covenant with Noah in Genesis 9? And I just flipped to Genesis 9. I'm trying to remember what he's talking about when he means. Larry, could you explain what you mean by the accounting? What verse are you referring to here?
Well, I think if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and just
go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, I think probably in verses 5 and 6, he says, "For your lifeblood I will require a reckoning or an accounting. From every beast I will require it, and from man, from his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." That's going through verse 6. And you might check the chat and see if that, I think Larry was adding something to that, but that, as far as I know, is the accounting or reckoning that is being talked about between God and Noah at that time. I don't know that I understand a lot about that, but I do think that there's a point being made here when in at the end of verse 6, God refers back to the statement that was made in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, when God made man in his image, humankind in his image, and gave them a place of responsibility, a role, as you've correctly said, I think, Jim, of stewardship. So we're not exactly in the same basket as the rest of creation, because we are given to be caretakers under God's authority there. So I think that he's referencing that, I guess, that special responsibility that human beings have, that you mentioned the additional value, perhaps. Something special about human beings. So there's an accounting that is beyond, if I happen to run over a goat in the road, for example, if I run over a human being, even if I didn't intend to, that's a much bigger deal. And I think that's at least part of what he's getting at there. I do think that the rest of the chapter, one of the most striking things about it, and this bears out very much, Jim, what you were saying as well, God speaks over and over again about a covenant he's making, but it is not a covenant only with human beings. he specifically says the creatures of the sea, the birds of the air, all of them, and the plants, that the earth itself is specifically referenced as a partner in this covenant. And there's one beautiful verse when he says, this covenant that I'm making between me and you and all the created things in the earth. So I think you have two messages going on here that is really cool. Human beings are given a special place and responsibility to steward and to care. Nonetheless, the rest of creation is in a partnership of covenant with God, and that lays obligations on us. I think that's really cool, and I appreciate Larry mentioning that chapter, because it's just, I love thinking about those things.
Yeah, that's true. I agree, and I thank Larry for that too. You notice he did add a little bit more to it, to his comment. But I wish I hadn't let that slip my mind when I was preparing this talk, because I would have loved to have included that in the talk itself.
Another researcher who is looking at environmental or ecological ethics from a Christian perspective is Kevin O'Brien. He's got several books out. One of the ones that I'm fond of, he co-authored with Catherine Blanchard. I had to look up both but it's called An Introduction to Christian Environmentalism, and there are 7 chapters looking at temperance and prudence and courage, and I always forget. Justice. Yes. Oh, there you go. How about that? And faith, hope, and love.
Yeah, that's a good book.
Oh,
I would
yes.
recommend that book.
Great.
Oh, and pardon?
I just concurring.
I will go ahead and the book is type that name of the book. I will do that, Renee or Kendrick, Dr. Jernigan. Can you type the name of the book in the chat? But while you're doing that, I'll go ahead and mention that we have been asked to give a list of resources for each of our talks that will be posted in the guidebook, so that anybody can have access to them. And excuse me, listed in my resources, or included in my list of resources, will be several books on this topic of Christian virtue ethics, Christian environmentalism, earthkeeping,